Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 47 of What to Think, VentureBeat's weekly technology podcast. I'm your host, Dylan Tweeney, the editor of VentureBeat. I'm here with Mark Sullivan.
Howdy.
He's a writer and reporter at VentureBeat. This week, we're going to be talking to David Cummins, a senior vice president at Xerox, who oversees the company's substantial parking systems business. Parking systems, you say? Yes, absolutely. David has a window on the future of urban transportation and driverless cars, and we're going to talk to him about how cities will be overtaken by swarms of driverless pods picking you up because nobody will own cars anymore. He's got a great picture of the future. But first, let's get some tech news highlights from VentureBeat.com. Here are three of our most popular stories from the last week. Let's start with Steve Jobs, the new biography. It's called Becoming Steve Jobs. And you know what's interesting to me about this, Mark, is that the authorized biography by Walter Isaacson came out a couple of years ago, right around the time that Jobs died. And it was the authorized biography. Like Jobs actually said, Mr. Isaacson, I want you to be my biographer. He spent hours and hours with the guy, totally gave him his blessing, opened up all kinds of things to him. And Isaacson wrote what lots of people thought was a very generally positive biography, very well received. But now, a lot of Apple people are kind of saying, you know, that Isaacson biography just trashed the man. That's not the man I knew. And this book, Becoming Steve Jobs, is the one that really paints him the way we knew Steve Jobs. He's kind of less of a jerk in this book.
From what I've read of it so far, I think the book does kind of portray him as, or at least portray the facet of him that, you know, is more concerned about family and maybe a better collaborator than what we saw in the Isaacson book, which was, you know, sort of this evil genius kind of guy who was extremely difficult to work with. And I think Bill Gates makes an interesting distinction in this book, and he's got some really interesting quotes. And he says that, yes, Jobs was possessed with trying to build the next great tech product. And he was very difficult to work with in the way that he was hard on people and expected a lot of people. But Gates says that he never felt like he was personally attacked by Jobs. He didn't feel like Jobs was sort of this aggressive person.
Well, Gates never worked for Jobs either. I think that was part of the thing, is like the stories about Jobs being a jerk are not so much about him being a ruthless titan of capitalism, which he arguably was, but about him being a very mercurial and sometimes prone to shout and insult people kind of boss.
True, Dylan. But go back into the days of the Mac when it was time for software companies to come in and build software for the Mac. Jobs was very hard on those people and kind of disrespectful. There are stories in the book about one guy from Lotus says that Gates was treated like a janitor by Jobs and his cronies in Cupertino. There's a lot of famous stories about him being terribly hard on employees, but he was really into marketing and stuff. And personally, I know people who have gone in from the ad agency side and witnessed the same really difficult person.
I wonder if there's some kind of maturation that happened in Jobs' life between his younger life and his older life. I haven't read the new book yet, but in the Isaacson book, it was really clear that Jobs as a young man was eccentric, weird, a little bit Svengali-like in his attempts to manipulate people. I don't think he took a bath for the whole first half of the book and made many references to that. So he was clearly a different person later when he was running a very successful company that he had turned around and reinvented the Mac, and the company had invented the iPhone and invented the iPad. And like clearly he had if maybe mellowed or maybe learned to work more cooperatively with people then.
A couple of thoughts there. I think, you know, during Apple's heyday or in Jobs' second app, he was said to be one of the last CEOs that was this powerful guy that could enforce this singularity of vision on the rest of the company and in the product design and the messaging and everything. But there's a part of the book where it says that Jobs gained the ability to appreciate, recognize other people's talents and use it more. Maybe Johnny Ive is an example, who's somebody who is a key player in sort of Jobs' second act at Apple.
Clearly, and Tim Cook as well. And it's clear that both of those guys, Tim Cook and Johnny Ives, have both spoken out against Walter Isaacson's book. So there you go.
Yeah.
Let's move on to another news story. This really caught my eye, actually, in the last week. Microsoft announced that it was going to be offering free upgrades to Windows 10 to anybody who has earlier versions, Windows 7 or 8. But here's the interesting thing. They're going to offer it to anyone, even if you have a pirated version of Windows 7 or 8, you'll still be able to upgrade to Windows 10. Isn't that? That's kind of novel.
I was amazed when I read this because it doesn't seem like it was that long ago that Microsoft was pretty aggressive working with the Software Publishers Association or whatever to go after people.
They still haul people into court for piracy. There's an interesting quote just saying, "We believe that customers over time will realize the value of properly licensing Windows." I think on the one hand, bravo for them. I mean, that's great. It's a pretty enlightened view towards software distribution. But I also wonder if that value of properly licensing Windows includes things like access to all of Microsoft's online services and the additional Office subscriptions and things like that they make recurring revenue from. So I wonder if this is not a recognition that Microsoft's revenue in the future is going to come from cloud-based services as opposed to just selling software licenses.
Yeah, that's what it seems like to me. It seems like all those revenue sources sort of hinge off Windows and Windows 10 in this case. And it really seems like this is a real attempt to sort of build that big number, that critical mass of people who are using this OS.
Yeah, pretty interesting. And Microsoft was quite explicit. Emil Podolinsky, who wrote this story for VentureBeat, actually reached out to Microsoft and got them to say, point blank, anyone with a qualified device can upgrade a pirated copy of Windows to Windows 10. So there you go. They're not pulling any punches on that.
Yeah, so if you want to get Windows 10, just go out and pirate an earlier version of the OS, and then you can get it for free.
That's exactly right. One quick story before we move to our host. Somebody did a study of Reddit to find out which are the worst and which are the best subreddits based on his analysis of toxicity of speech, hate speech, and outright attacks on other users and things like that, as well as, comparing them to the subreddits where the people are most supportive. So very quickly, the most toxic community, Mark Sullivan.
Shit Reddit says.
There you go.
Ding, ding, ding.
44% toxicity score and 1.7% supportiveness score. Surprising. There's also a very bigoted subreddit called The Red Pill. I've never been there, but apparently it's a forum dedicated to proud male chauvinism, where bigoted comments receive overwhelming approval from the community.
Yay! You're a jerk! Yay!
On the other hand, he did point out the most supportive subreddits, at least at the time he did his study, were Get Motivated, Lose It, and DIY. I'm just a little worried knowing how Reddit works, that now that he has published the names of these subreddits, that they might get overwhelmed by people from the red pill. Right. So let's hope you guys keep your communities together, keep being supportive, hang in there, keep the faith. Before we go to our guest, David Cummins from Xerox, we are going to take a moment to thank our host and sponsor, New Relic. New Relic helps customers make sense of billions of data points about millions of applications in real time. Let's get specific. More than 250,000 users leverage the company's cloud-based solution to analyze more than 690 billion data points per day, generated by more than 4 million application instances. For more on New Relic's offerings, go to newrelic.com and tell them that VentureBeat sent you. And now I'd like to welcome our guest, David Cummins. He's a Senior Vice President of Mobility Solutions for Xerox. He's had a long career at Xerox, and before that, doing operations planning and management for the Salt Lake 2002 Olympic Organizing Committee and other positions. So, David, thank you very much for joining us on What to Think.
My pleasure. You're
sort of described as like Xerox's parking guy. You must get invited to all the parties, being a parking expert.
I'm very popular at cocktail parties.
What does Xerox actually do in the parking field? And we'll expand this out from parking, because I know there's a lot more to it than just that.
Yeah, so Xerox 5 years ago acquired a company called ACS to diversify into services. And in fact, services now represent 57% of Xerox's revenue. And the types of services we're involved in would surprise you. Everything from processing of child support payments, Medicare processing, and we have a large transportation services business, really focused on providing transportation services to governments around the world. And one of the oldest transportation businesses that we've been in for some 30 years is parking, which happens to be a pretty significant revenue source for a lot of cities. So it was one of the original modes of transportation that were outsourced by cities.
So when you say parking services, you don't mean like valet services. You mean the infrastructure that cities use to manage parking, whether that's coin-op parking meters or digital parking meters or what have you, right?
Exactly. In fact, we process parking tickets as well for cities. We don't write tickets, but from the moment it hits a windshield until it's paid, we control that for cities.
So is that a big business?
It is. You take a city like New York, they're generating something in the neighborhood of $600 million a year in parking revenue. A typical model for a well-run city is for every $1 in paid meter revenue, you collect $3 to $4 in violation revenue. So the violation side of the business is not well recognized, but is a significant revenue source for a number of cities.
Surprising. I would have thought the parking stuff would have been more constant and greater revenue source, but that's way more than parking.
It sounds like they really are out to get you.
The whole writing of tickets and the volumes that we're seeing is actually on decline, and that's a good thing. I mean, compliance is going up. It's going up because it's easier to pay for parking. It used to be you drive around, and then when you get to the place, you have enough coins in your glove box to pay for the space. Mm-hmm. And then when you actually get there and you're off at your restaurant or your appointment, you're thinking, oh my goodness, has the time up yet? And maybe I have to go run back and feed the meter. And then that anxiety of, is there a ticket waiting for me? That whole process is what we like to say, a painful process. And how can we take the pain out of parking with technology?
Have you ever heard anybody in a city government express dismay that it's becoming easier to pay for parking and so that there's less violations and then less revenue?
I think there's been definitely a lot of concern that can be coming. One of the things that we've noticed is that there might be less meter overtime type violations, people just not paying for the meters. But there are always violations out there. There's always people double parking in front of fire hydrants and crosswalks and things like that. So we think that we're probably a number of years away from starting to see that curve trend down significantly. But there is less violations out there because it is easier. When you can pay with your cell phone, that's a huge convenience. When you can add time from your cell phone within the restaurant to that meter, that's a huge convenience, and that's good for the industry.
We've seen some experiments like right here in San Francisco with dynamic pricing for parking where a smart parking meter might charge 25 cents for 15 minutes ordinarily, but if there's a ball game on or something, it would charge you more. I wonder if that kind of surge pricing, while perhaps unpopular, might do things to both smooth out the availability of parking spots and also increase the amount of revenue that cities are generating from the really hot zones.
Yeah, in fact, we were instrumental in that San Francisco project. We put in the sensors in every parking space that detects if a car is parked there. We did it in Los Angeles. We've done it in Indianapolis. We're now doing it in Washington, D.C. And it's tied back into a pricing engine that we've developed that basically is algorithm-driven and determining what is the optimal rate by block face, by time of day, by day of week. And in fact, in Los Angeles, which is the project we've most recently seen the results of, we were able to see a reduction in parking congestion of 10% with our raising and lowering of rates. In Los Angeles, we ended up lowering rates in 60% of the spaces over this 18-month period and only raising them in 30% of the spaces. Why is that the case? In one of the most congested cities in the country, it's because there are pockets of congestion in LA. There's certain areas that nobody parks, and there's certain areas that everybody wants to park in. And so what we encourage, what we call demand-based pricing, we don't call it surge pricing.
That's a smart choice of words,
yeah,
yes.
Exactly. But quite frankly, we suggest that you change rates quarterly, maybe monthly. If you change them in kind of this dynamic surge type of a way, you're catching people off guard. They can't plan ahead.
And then they really get angry, yeah.
Well, not only do they get angry, you're not accomplishing what you're trying to do, which is change behavior. You're trying to get someone that normally would park on this block face, now that the price is higher, will opt to park in another block face where there's more availability.
Right.
To park off street.
There's still an information asymmetry there in that the people who are parking need to know something about the availability. And it sounds like you could do that. Like if you have sensors on parking spaces, there could be a way through an app or some other means to say, well, there's no parking here, but if you go 2 blocks to the west, you'll find more parking and it will be cheaper.
What we're working with the auto OEMs to develop is, picture this. You're in your car, and let's say you have this voice recognition, like a Siri-like conversation with your vehicle, that I'm going to such and such restaurant downtown. And as you're getting close, the car will suggest that there's parking available on such and such a block. Would you like to park there? It's this hourly rate. And you would say yes, and it would direct you to that parking space. And, of course, we know cars park themselves these days. And so the car would park itself and then would begin the payment transaction as well.
How are we sure that the car is not going to like drive itself to a bar and get a couple drinks on the way or joyride itself around the town before it parks?
Well, and you're talking about the natural progression to the self-driving vehicle.
Yes.
Right? And that is where the world is heading. It is no longer your car. And the car is making informed decisions based on user preferences. But ultimately, we're getting to a world where I refer to it as zero ownership. Mm-hmm. The future, particularly in urban transportation or urban mobility, is going to be a bunch of cars or pods or what have you driving around that are not owned by anyone.
They're owned by somebody. They might be owned by Uber or something, right?
Exactly. Google, Uber, Apple, whoever.
Or the city, potentially. Yeah.
And most definitely regulated by the city.
Yeah,
and that's one of the things that we are trying to address as well. Is it's a bit of the Wild West out there in mobility today. And so you have not just some of the more famous players like Uber and Lyft, but you have Car2Go and Zipcar. And now you have all of the auto OEMs coming out with their own self-driving vehicles and also vehicles with varying levels of automation. You have Google, you have Apple. And so it's pretty exciting, but it also is pretty fragmented and not controlled. And so we need to think about how cities are going to manage a bunch of driverless cars. I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago in Los Angeles, and the Uber representative and the LA Taxi Cab Commission representative were there. And the LA person was saying, we have 2,000 drivers in the city of LA. And he looked over at the Uber guy, and the Uber guy said, well, we have 10,000 drivers in the city of LA. And just because of UberX, right? These are individuals, part-time workers, using their own vehicles, along with, the black car, more standard Uber fare. And so what we're seeing is just this abundance of new options for getting from point A to point B. And a lot of them are very cool and very good for cities, but at the same time, they need to be controlled to a certain extent. And so we're looking to work with cities in creating what we call a mobility marketplace, where private and public providers, so public providers might be the bike share system of a city or the taxi cab system or the public transit system, all have the same ability to compete and share data with the private providers in a market. Think of it like a NASDAQ type market where these mobility providers can come together and the end users, the consumers in a given city, can see in one place, whether they're using a single app or a different app, but they have access to all of the different options, as opposed to going to different apps and having different relationships and different credit cards with 4 or 5 different mobility providers, which a typical millennial has today.
Then the role of government there is not just as a regulator, but in a way a provider of kind of the data backplane that all these different apps and services plug into.
Absolutely. So how can you create a marketplace that has open data and the free flow of information and a certain level playing field? Let's face it.
Right.
That really puts the city in a very powerful position. It's a fascinating idea and maybe the most fair one possible, but it seems like there might be a lot of resistance to putting a city in that position.
Not to mention, cities have to be pretty visionary to see this kind of future coming and embrace it, I would think.
That's absolutely right. And there are quite a few mayors out there, I think of Mayor Garcetti in LA, that are thinking about just this evolution that's taking place. I mean, the mayor said in a conference about a month ago that he wants LA to be the first big city for self-driving vehicles.
Wow.
He wants them to come to his town. And so he wants to figure out a way to create a framework to coordinate them. For insurance reasons, for regulatory reasons, you want to know where these vehicles are. You want to know who's using them and how they're using them. And so I think that when we think of the role of cities, it doesn't have to be kind of an onerous, bureaucratic controlling of the market, but think of it as creating regulations, and a lot of states and cities have done this recently in response to the Ubers and Lyfts of the world, but creating regulations that really support these new mobility providers. Because let's face it, we don't know who the next Uber is going to be. Yeah. And probably it's going to be a different set of companies in 5 years. I think of these three-wheeled vehicles that are coming out, a lot of these auto OEMs, or you go to the auto shows and they have these things that I would call like a pod. And, we have dedicated bike lanes in most cities today. Soon we're going to have dedicated pod lanes as well. There's going to be less and less real estate available for four-wheel vehicles, definitely for SUVs. And so as the urban landscape is changing, first of all, they need to provide as many opportunities as possible because the millennials now make up 50% of the urban workforce. The millennials generally don't own a car or drive their own car, if they do own one, and they try 3 or 4 more different ways to get from point A to point B, multimodal way. So cities need to, if they want to have a competitive advantage over the next city, they need to create a mobility framework that does encourage the free market principles, but at the same time, does it in a way where it's a fair playing field.
You painted a really interesting futuristic picture where self-driving cars are kind of going around in these pod cars are going around picking you up whenever you need a ride, and they're not really owned by anybody or by any of the consumers anyway. How far away are we from that kind of fully autonomous vehicle / urban infrastructure that supports that kind of vision?
The 3 major trends towards this notion of zero ownership in terms of personal vehicle ownership as opposed to companies owning a fleet of vehicles, the 3 major drivers are the millennials. And if this trend holds true for the millennials, the late 20s, early 30s somethings, not even having a driver's license. 75% have a driver's license, my goodness. And so if that trend continues, and we're already seeing the metric in transportation is vehicle miles traveled. We're already seeing year-over-year declines in vehicle miles traveled, particularly in an urban area. So if that trend continues, you overlay that with a second big trend, which is the sharing economy, the Ubers and the Car2Gos and so forth. And then the third trend is, of course, the autonomous vehicles, the self-driving vehicles. The Googles and the Fords would say they're going to roll out a self-driving vehicle in 4 to 5 years. And so I think that that's possible, probable even.
What do you see as qualifying as a self-driving car in 4 or 5 years? Something that can take you anywhere you want to go, or self-driving within certain limited circumstances?
I think we make a lot of hoopla over this when I guess my perspective is that we're seeing so many levels of automation in vehicles. I referred earlier to a car parking itself.
Right.
There's all this, adaptive cruise control and where the car takes over control when they see potential accident coming. And there's going to be more and more of those incremental type changes each year over the next 5 years. By the time a car comes out the factory line without a steering wheel on it, people are going to be like, oh, yeah, whatever.
It'll be like a phone without a dial pad on it. I think at first people will be like, oh my God, that's an abomination. But then pretty soon they'll all be doing it.
David, it occurs to me that, and I completely agree with you that that's how this whole thing is going to happen with autonomous driving. And maybe that's a better way because it might give the insurance industry and our legal framework time to sort of slowly, incrementally develop precedents and policies around autonomous driving, as the technology sort of moves forward.
Absolutely. Somebody asked me the other day, what is an event that's going to kind of augur in this acceptance of self-driving vehicles? Because there is obviously a lot of anxiety. I think you raised the right point. I think there's going to be, a lawsuit or some regulatory action when one of the OEMs comes out with a car in like 2 years that does such and such a level of automation that people are like, oh my goodness, that we need to deal with that. And somebody sues or some legislature decides they're just going to pass some legislation in regards to it, what have you. I think that there's going to be a lot of activity long before that truly autonomous vehicle hits the streets, such that there might be a collective shrug, as I said before.
Do you think cities in general are prepared for the kind of changes that transport technologies are going to bring us in the next 5 years?
There's such wide variety among cities. I think what's probably the most exciting and ironic to me is that all of this conversation is being driven out of U.S. cities. And, being in the transportation business for 12 years now, we always looked for innovation overseas. We always looked to Europe or Asia for the innovation.
Oh, interesting. Is that because Americans were just fixated on doing things the way they were doing them, with driving around in their cars?
Yeah, exactly. And so, the whole notion of mobile payments, that came out of Europe. Mm-hmm. And, public transportation technologies and using smart card payments, things like that, that all came out of Europe and Asia. So we've been a bit of the laggards, the slow adopters. But as it relates to this new form of urban mobility, I think we really are paving the way, and it's pretty interesting to see. So I would say that there are cities that are embracing it, and we all know of the examples of cities and states that have kind of tried to stiff arm it and say, wait, this doesn't work for our taxi cab medallion system, to use one example. I think that it will vary across the U.S., and it'll happen in an organic way. I don't think like the U.S. Department of Transportation is necessarily going to weigh in. Maybe they will at one point to create standards, but they're usually a few years behind what cities are doing and what's actually happening out on the streets. So we'll see how it plays out.
I just think it's fascinating. I mean, your comment about the U.S. sort of leading the way, because that's happening with this whole cultural thing in the U.S. about, I'm going to get in my car and I'm going to drive down Route 66, and it's this whole romantic notion. And yet I talked to the CEO of Ford Motor Company at CES, and he's talking about the same things you are, about a future where nobody even owns their own car.
I've talked to a number of the OEMs, including Ford, and if you ask them what they're investing their R&D in, it's mobility. If you read their marketing materials and see their commercials, they all talk of them and describe themselves as providers of mobility. They're reading the tea leaves. They're seeing how this new generation doesn't have that same self-identity from what they drive, if you will, and they find their identity in other things. And, let's face it, rather than go out and hang out in someone else's house or go hang out in the mall like some of us did when we were kids, they're doing it with their cell phones, right? They're texting, and this notion that you need to have your own car in high school and your own car kind of reflects your personality, I think that's going away. It'll be interesting to see how these auto companies adapt. And they're already starting. I think Ford is a very progressive example.
I'm kind of hoping that future comes sooner rather than later, because I have a daughter entering high school in the fall, and I can buy an awful lot of nice smartphones for her for the price of a car. And they're much safer, too. David, thank you very much for joining us. You've got a great view on the future of transportation, and it was really fun talking to you and hearing your views on things.
Well, thank you for having me. I am very optimistic. I think the future bodes well for us all.
Thanks, David. Enjoyed it.
David Cummins is a Senior Vice President of Mobility Solutions for Xerox. Thanks, David, and thank you for joining us for What to Think, VentureBeat's technology news podcast. As always, you can find us online at VentureBeat.com, where we publish dozens, if not many more, news stories a day about the technology and business worlds. And if you haven't subscribed to our podcast in iTunes yet, please do. Check it out. Just go onto iTunes and search for What to Think. Until next week, I'm Dylan Tweeney.
And I'm Mark Sullivan.
Catch you later.